Today on X, I saw an interesting graphic that showed that when you compare President Trump and J.D. Vance, their professional careers against the careers of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, you notice that there's no private sector experience with Harris or Walz, but there's a lot of private sector experience with Trump and with Vance. And this got me thinking about a video I've been meaning to shoot for a couple years now, which is to discuss where do America's judges come from and what are their backgrounds and how does this matter to your right to keep and bear arms? This is something that I have a lot of thoughts on, and I think this is a good opportunity to discuss the backgrounds of federal judges and why it matters so much to your rights. Let's talk about it when we get back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and author of the brand new best-selling book, Israel Disarmed. Check it out on Amazon. And of course, don't forget that this weekend in Knoxville, Tennessee, I will be at the Gun Owners of America event signing books from 1 to 1:45 on Saturday. And I will be on a legal panel talking about the Second Amendment from 12:45 p.m. to 1:30 on Sunday, day 2 of the Gun Owners of America conference or convention down there in Knoxville, Tennessee this coming weekend. All right, folks. So with that said, I want to talk about where our federal judges come from, because this is extremely important. This is a very nuanced point that not a lot of people understand, but I want to make you the smartest person in the room. And when you understand what I'm saying and what's happened here, a lot of things that you've been seeing in the press with our Second Amendment rights with these judges will make more sense. Specifically, what got me thinking was if I compare the credentials of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance on the one hand with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, the vice presidential candidate for her. On the other hand, you notice that basically the Democrats have nothing but public sector experience. They don't work in the private sector. In contrast, Donald Trump, of course, spent his whole career in the private sector, as did a large percentage of J.D. Vance's career. Now, this is not nothing, because as I used to talk about with my business clients back in the day, I would explain to them there's two types of people in the world, and it's important for you to keep this in mind, okay? There are two types of people in the world when it comes to the world of business and whatnot. And that is, there's people that sign the front of the check, and there's people that sign the back of the check. The employers really do understand the importance of government regulations, taxation, the risks of business, and signing the front of the check as the employer, as the boss, is really an eye-opening experience because it teaches you a lot about the world that you might otherwise miss if you've never been the employer. In contrast, obviously, there's nothing wrong with signing the back of the check, but if signing the back of the check, you're the employee working for someone else who's responsible for going out and getting the money to pay you. Now, the reason why I bring this up is this really does impact the mentality of people, especially and including, of course, federal judges. Now, why do I say this? Now, when I first started practicing law in the late 1990s, I would have to look at the judges that I was appearing from to try a case and from these federal judges. And their credentials went along the following lines. And then I'm going to compare what I'm about to say with today's judges in so many instances. Back in the day, these federal judges in the 90s and the 2000s, you would look at their bios and it would read like this. Okay, they'd go to Princeton undergrad, they would go to NYU Law School, have these elite credentials, then they would all clerk for a federal judge for a year, another very elite, prestigious thing that certain people have the opportunity to do. Then they would go work for a law firm and they would spend 10, 15, 20 years working for a major law firm representing clients in the real world. Greek diner owners in a fight over a zoning regulation, real estate developers, employer-employee fights, whatever it is. And in many of those instances, when they were working in the private sector, they would have an opportunity to fight against the government. Here I just said to fight against the government, because the government might come in with sort of allegations of security fraud, or they might argue tax fraud, or some other headache, or try to say that you built your building wrong. Whatever it was, these private sector lawyers would fight against the government. And again, when I first started practicing law, these bios consisted of all these lawyers who had been private sector lawyers at law firms for many years, and then after they'd been private sector prominent attorneys, they became partner of the firms, meaning they were part owners of these law firms. They were signed the front of the check, meaning they were now bosses. They were employers, worried about the employees and so on. And then, of course, they would be elevated to the federal bench and become federal judges with a perspective of seeing the good and the bad of government, because they often fought against the government. And they had a lot of different perspectives on this stuff. Now, in contrast, today, what we're starting to see, and I've noticed this, even when I was on the Donald Trump presidential transition team in 2016, I started to notice the credentials of even conservative-oriented judges. They would look a lot different in many cases. It would look a lot like this. It would be, okay, yes, they would still go to Princeton or Yale undergraduate. Yes, they would still go to some fancy law school like NYU. And then they would, of course, do their federal clerkships with some federal judge. All that remained the same. So, yeah, okay, that's the way it goes. But then this is where the break off occurs from the past. You started to see a lot more people would go from those federal clerkships right into working for like the Department of Justice. They would become assistant U.S. attorneys, or they'd work for the Department of Labor. But they started becoming permanent government employees working for the federal government as attorneys. And then after 10 or 15 years of working in and around the government as a prosecutor or for the Department of Justice, Department of Labor, whatever it was, EEOC, it doesn't matter, they would then get nominated to become a federal judge and get elevated to the bench. So here you had, back in the day, lawyers that actually experienced private sector problems, including fighting against the government. And today what we're seeing, in my view, is more and more people who go to become federal judges have spent the bulk of their careers working for the public sector, getting a check as an employee from the government, which to me, I don't like that trend, because in my professional opinion, having litigated in front of a lot of these judges over the years and knowing a lot of these kinds of people, the problem is when these people spend their careers working as prosecutors on behalf of the government, working for the government, they start to develop a bias that the government is the good guy. Now, sometimes the government is a good guy, right? There are instances where government does good and necessary functions, but there are many instances, as you know, where government becomes tyrannical. This weekend, for example, we saw Secret Service agents allegedly broke into a salon in Massachusetts to use the bathroom for 2 hours. That's a story we'll cover somewhere else. But the point is, there are plenty of instances where government overreach and government screws stuff up and government becomes bullies. We'll talk a whole separate video about prosecutors. I have a fun one. You public defenders out there that watch this channel, you're going to like this one, because as a general matter, I support public defenders over prosecutors, frankly, because I think it's a much more difficult job to be a public defender and a criminal defense lawyer than it is to work as a prosecutor, which I think is a relatively easy job. But that's a topic for a different video. But for today, I just want you to understand that one of the problems we're seeing in the Second Amendment movement and the constitutional movement is you go in front of some judges and their entire professional experience is with and for the government. They work for the government. And that's there's a lot of problems with that, because again, they have this skewed perspective that the people that have been paying their bills their entire career are always the good guys, and they have a bias in favor of that. This is a main reason, by the way, why the Department of Justice with Jack Smith and Merrick Garland wanted to go after the January 6th people. They wanted to go after Donald Trump. They wanted to go after all these people like Steve Bannon. They wanted to do all this stuff, and they love doing it in D.C., because what you find in D.C. with the D.C. Court of Appeals and the D.C. District Courts there, you find countless judges who, of course, spent their career in and around D.C., in and around the federal government. And they're, even if they're trying to be honest brokers, and I think a lot of them are trying to be honest brokers, the point, though, is that they've been swimming in a sea of government is good and government is great and government pays my bills and I'm a government employee and I love the government. It's just kind of what comes out of their career choices. And of course, you also have the point that people who support the notion of big government, that think government is a force for good, they just have a bias personally that they're more interested in working for government, where people that are, let's just say, cynical about government and government power are more likely to gravitate toward the private sector. So with all of this said, the point I want you to understand is the modern trend toward putting people on the federal bench that have spent the bulk of their professional careers working for or around government is something that, as a general matter, we in the Second Amendment community should, as a generally speaking, not prefer. I would much prefer to see someone that has been in the private sector, been a public defender, been a criminal defense lawyer, that's actually fought against government reach. They've encountered bullying prosecutors. They've seen that government has taken positions that are really frivolous in court because there's no recourse or no downside to the government lawyers because they can't get fired, as a general matter, and they can't get sued by anyone, and they don't even have clients, right? Their clients are like nobody, so they don't even have that checking them. And of course, their budgets are infinite because, unlike a private sector, if I give my client a bill that's too big, well, they're not going to be able to pay it, and that's no good for anybody. So you don't have those considerations in the public sector, like, oh, the budget's going to be too much or the bill's going to be too big. In the private sector, you have to deal with those constraints, and that makes you a smarter person. And in my view, ultimately, a lot of private sector experience makes you a much better judge because you really do understand there's two sides to many battles. You understand what's really happening when witnesses testify. You have a much better feel for business. You have a much better feel for the real world than if you spend your entire life working for government, doing government things, which is absolutely not the real world as far as I'm concerned. So anyway, just something to keep in mind about judges, who's on the federal bench. So when they look at these Second Amendment cases, a lot of these judges have a view that government is good and it's good if government has guns, and maybe you don't want market and you guys to have guns because that might make it harder for the government to do the government's good work. And you can kind of see how that bias plays into this. And I don't support it, but again, it's my job here on the Four Boxes Down to try to tell you about what's going on in the real world in ways that you just are not going to be able to learn because if you're not in a certain space, if you don't know certain people, if you haven't flown around a particular area, how would you possibly know? So I'm trying to convey this information to you so you become the smartest person in the room and understand the real world dynamics that we're up against in defending our Bill of Rights and defending our Constitution, of course, and defending our right to keep and bear arms. All right, folks, hope you learned something here today. Make sure you come on down and say hi if you're in Knoxville, Tennessee this weekend at the Gun Owners of America event. Don't forget to follow me on X at 4boxes, and we'll see you again soon here at the 4 Boxes Down.
Orders up. Table 2A.